So we're going to start talking about potassium. Today we're going to talk about potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, which will be the rest of the macronutrients. And then next week we're going to do the micronutrients, which we're not going to do them all. We're just going to talk about iron, manganese, zinc, copper, and boron. And then I'll also talk about liming acid soils and adding acid materials to calcareous soils. So that'll be what we'll finish up with next week. So I know it's a little bit of change compared to what some of you thought I was going to be doing. I apologize for that. What I had on my list was that we would do nitrogen the first week, phosphorus the second week, and then potassium the third week, and micronutrients on the fourth week. So if I missed something up there, I apologize. So anyway, this is where we are today. So the potassium cycle. Potassium we typically get from the mineral called sylvite. This is the mineral that is mined and then purified to make our OO60, which is potassium chloride. Now, if you're working with organics, sylvite can be used as a source of the organic for the organic source of potassium. It is mainly potassium chloride. But when you grind it up as a rock, or excuse me, as a mineral, then the mineral sylvite, you can use it as a source of organic potassium. If it's purified into potassium chloride, we would call potash, or OO60, then it would not be allowed to use it as an organic because it had been manufactured. So, as a mineral sylvite, you can use it. Manufactured as OO60, you would not be able to use it as an organic. So the cycle, potassium cycle. There's a couple of different minerals that we get potassium from in the soil, the feldspars and the micas. Those are the two dominant ones that we will get potassium from, and from a natural standpoint. The other part that we get it from is animals and plants that are decaying. But you'll notice in this particular case that there is no mineralization or immobilization like we've had with nitrogen and phosphorus. And the reason for this is that potassium is not part of the organic molecule. So we can take either live vegetation or dead vegetation, shake it up with water, and we can basically extract the potassium that's in that vegetation. So as soon as the dead animal or the dead plant hits the soil surface and we get a little precipitation, then that potassium comes out and is available to the plant. So there is no mineralization part. It is basically available as soon as it hits the soil. Some of the ways that we can lose it are with fixation. We actually see some fixation with some 2-to-1 clays, but we also release the potassium from the micas. Again, the feldspars, the primary minerals, are going to be the micas, and the feldspars that we're going to get most of the potassium from from a mineralization standpoint, or from a weathering standpoint of the different minerals. Within the soil solution, most of the potassium is taken up through the soil solution or from the exchangeable, which is where most of the potassium resides in the soil. So that's where most of the potassium actually comes from that's plant available, is what we call exchangeable. Now, potassium, unlike phosphorus and nitrate, functions as a cation. Therefore, it's going to adhere to the exchange sites from the clay and the organic matter. So the clay and the organic matter in most of our soils has, again, a net negative charge, and that negative charge has to be neutralized by some kind of cation. And potassium or ammonia can satisfy that part of that negative charge. And most of the time we don't get very much ammonia on the soils because of that mineralization process that's going on and the nitrification process that goes on, taking most of the nitrogen all the way through to nitrate. Whereas with potassium, we will actually see quite a bit of it that can be on the exchange site. Now, you notice that there are arrows going between the potassium in solution and potassium on the exchange sites, and there will set up to be a equilibrium between the potassium in the soil solution and the potassium on the exchange site. So as the plant is taking potassium out of the soil solution, the potassium on the exchange sites will be taking care of releasing potassium back into the soil solution so that the plant will have additional potassium to take up. The other source of potassium that we have, of course, is going to be our fertilizer or inorganic potassium, which would be 0060, which is potassium chloride. The losses that we see most of the time with potassium are going to be more losses associated with erosion. And the primary reason for that is because it is adhering to the cation exchange site. So we have to have sediment or organic material being taken off of the surface of the soil. So from an erosion standpoint, we lose more potassium that way as compared to runoff. We lose a little bit from runoff, but not very much. Now, in sandy soils, this is a different story. Because we don't have a very high cation exchange capacity in sandy soils, then we also lose some of this potassium through leaching and also from a runoff standpoint. Now, where this is more prevalent is in our golf courses. If you look at most of our golf greens, most of those are going to be sand on top of whatever the native soil was. And so it may be 6 to 12 inches of sand on top of whatever that native soil happened to be. And so we do get quite a bit of leaching of potassium out of those kinds of soils. If you're in East Texas, especially the acid sandy soils that we find a lot in our East Texas areas, then we do get quite a bit of leaching of potassium in those kinds of situations just because we have acid soils, and the second thing is they're very sandy. So some general information on potassium. First of all, it's one of the 8 most abundant elements in the Earth's crust, one of the 6 most abundant elements in the soils, and it's part of the micaceous minerals and also the potassium feldspars. It is a basic cation. The 4 basic cations that we have are calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. If we take a look at what we have from a standpoint of reserves across the world for potassium, like we talked about the phosphorus last week, we've got about 100 large buried deposits of potassium that are of commercial quality, and then we've got about 100 potassium brine deposits that can be easily mined. So what's brine? Well, brine is deposited from an ocean standpoint. So the ocean is actually fairly high in potassium as well, and so where those deposits are, then we can actually mine that and produce potassium fertilizers. It's located in 13 countries, with Canada and Russia having about 75% of the world reserves and about 73% of the reserve basis. So if you take a look at the reserves of potash, you see that Canada's got about 53%, Russia's about 22%, and if you look at the United States, we're down here at about 1% of the reserves. Thank goodness we're friends with Canada, who has the majority of the reserves across the world. And today we get a lot of our potassium out of Canada. Potential reserves are estimated at about 250 billion tons with a reserve base of about 18 billion tons. And we've got about 8.3 billion tons that are commercially exploitable today. So at the present and projected use rates, we have about 600 years of mineable reserves. So a little bit better than the phosphorus. Phosphorus, we're looking at somewhere between 25 and about 100 years, depending on where you happen to be looking at. With the potassium, we're looking at about 600 years. So we've got a lot more of the potassium, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to conserve it any more than we need to conserve our phosphorus. So we really need to start looking at better ways of utilizing our potassium and our phosphorus as compared to the way we're doing it today. So to give you an example of how the minerals weather, especially the mica weathers, to release the potassium. Most of you probably played with mica before. It's that mineral that you can take and you can peel the sheets apart. You usually have either a very light colored that is dominated mainly by magnesium, or you have a very dark colored mica that's dominated by iron. So when you peel those layers apart, if you noticed it, you have a very white colored powder between those layers, and that white colored powder is actually potassium, and that holds those layers together. Not a very strong bond, a very weak bond actually, but as the soil weathers, as that particular mineral weathers, then the edges of the mica, we start to grind the mica down, and what we end up having is, from a clay standpoint, is illite. And the illite starts to weather and fray at the edges, and as that frays at the edges, then the potassium is actually released. And eventually we'll go from the mica to the illites, and finally we end up at vermiculite from a clay standpoint, with virtually no potassium or very little potassium left within the inner layer between the clay particles. So potassium losses. First thing that we want is we want the crop uptake or crop removal. The second thing that can happen, again, is the leaching. Highest potential is in our acid sandy soils. So if you're looking at the different potentials as far as leaching is concerned, the nitrate's always going to be the greatest. The phosphate's going to be much, much, much less. And then sulfate will be kind of in between the nitrates and the potassium. Well, excuse me, the nitrates and the sulfate. Well, where's the potassium end up in here? Well, it's usually somewhere around the sulfate as far as its leaching potential. So even though it's a cation, it still has a leaching potential that's very similar to sulfate as an anion. We do have a high potential for erosion, again, because it adheres to the cation exchange capacity on the clay particles and on the organic material. We do have a runoff potential because most of the potassium compounds are fairly soluble. And so until when we first put them on the surface, especially if we're using a broadcast application across the surface, then if we get a little bit of real hard rainfall, we have a much higher potential to lose some of that potassium from a runoff standpoint just because of its solubility. Fixation. We can actually fix the potassium. We talked about fixation with the phosphorus, and that was with iron and aluminum compounds mainly. Well, the fixation of potassium comes with clays mainly, and so we see it with vermiculite and to some extent with some of the smectites. The smectite, again, is a shrinking swelling clays that we see. Vermiculite, the vermiculite clay that we're talking about here is not the vermiculite that you see in potting soils. Okay, two different things. The vermiculite clay that we have is going to be a very, very fine particle size. It's going to be in the clay size range. It does have a little bit of expansion expansion capabilities, but not like the smectites do. So if we're dealing with, if we've got vermiculite in the soil, and a lot of soils in the state of Texas will have a little bit of vermiculite, but not a lot. When we oven dry, the potassium will be increased, so it actually releases the potassium. If we're looking at smectite, if we've got smectites or the shrinking swelling clays that you probably are familiar with, upon oven drying, the potassium will actually decrease. So the smectites will actually fix the potassium, whereas the vermiculite usually has a tendency to release potassium that might have been fixed from a wet standpoint. Supplying power, most plant available potassium is going to be on the exchange site. So the exchange sites supply potassium to the soil solution, and then the potassium is taken up by in the soil solution. But the majority of it's going to be stored on the exchange sites. Kinds and amounts of potassium-bearing minerals, it depends on the particle size of those minerals. And so if we take the feldspars and the micas and we get those into the silt size or the clay size fraction, then they become much more available to the plant. The potassium supplying capacity is always going to be a function of the potassium that's held in the structure of the soil minerals, so the native soil potassium. And we're very, very fortunate in the state of Texas in that we have a tremendous amount of micas and feldspars in most of our soils across the state of Texas, with the exception of areas like the acid soils that we have mainly in the eastern part of the state, and especially the acid sandy soils that we have. So what we're trying to do with, if we're taking a look at potassium, potassium is one of the elements that really has an issue with luxury consumption. Now, most elements do not, but potassium can be luxury consumed, and so the plant will take up more than it actually needs, and in some cases we can actually, at the end of the growing season, become potassium deficient. And so depending on the amount of potassium that's actually recommended, we may recommend that the potassium be spoon-fed similar to the nitrogen. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the luxury consumption. The second is that most of our potassium sources are very salty. And so if we have a very high recommendation, and I'll go over what those recommendations are later, if we have a very high recommendation, then we can actually salt out the plants or salt out the seeds, depending on what's actually planted. So at times, depending on how much potassium is recommended, how much supplying power we have from the soil, then we may actually recommend that it be applied a couple of different times across the growing season, as compared to normally we would recommend that it would all be put out at the first application with the nitrogen and with the phosphorus that comes out either early in the spring for your spring and summer crop, or early in the fall for your fall and winter crops. So if you're looking at a bag of fertilizer, you always have three numbers on it. The first number is always a percent nitrogen, the second number is always a percent P2O5, and the third number is always a percent K2O. Now, like we've looked at with the nitrogen and phosphorus, the different sources of phosphorus and nitrogen are what's actually going to be in the bag, but that's how it's reported. So with nitrogen, it's going to be urea, ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, things like that, or monoammonium phosphate, diammonium phosphate would be some of the sources of nitrogen and phosphorus that we would have actually in the bag. And so when you look at that bag of fertilizer, you have to read the fine print to see what actually is in the bag that is representing the nitrogen, the P2O5, and the K2O. Most of the time, the potassium is going to be potassium chloride. Every once in a while, it'll be potassium nitrate. Sometimes it might be potassium sulfate, or what we call sulfomag, and we'll go over some of that in a little bit. Now, notice that there's another part to this on this particular label. It says potential acidity equivalent to 300 pounds of calcium carbonate per ton. So when we add sources of nutrients, whether it be organic or inorganic, most of the time we are adding acidifying materials to the soil. So the net reaction of almost every nutrient that we apply, like I said, whether it be organic or inorganic, will give a net acidifying process to the soil. So in this particular case, this analysis that was on the bag of fertilizer, and this usually comes on there, tells you how much acid will be generated from those sources of nutrients. And so if you were in a process of adding or trying to maintain a pH, you would actually need to apply a certain amount of calcium carbonate to take care of any acidity that would be generated by those sources of nutrients. Now, when this is put on the bag, it also represents 100% pure calcium carbonate. And we'll talk about what that means next week when we talk about adding limestone and to neutralize acidity, and adding acidifying materials to neutralize alkalinity. So again, potassium sources are going to be some primary minerals, primarily the micas and the illite, and then the feldspar. If you look at plant residue, most of the plant residues are going to contain somewhere between 1 and 2% potassium. The animal manures and residues are going to contain somewhere between 0.5 and 3% potassium. Now that's as potassium, not K2O. Fertilizers, again, mainly from a sylvite, and it's on the bag of fertilizer it's listed as K2O, and it's also referred as potash. Well, where does that name come from? Well, if any of you have ever made lye soap, you probably have a pretty good idea. We take ashes of wood, burned wood, which is very high in potassium, and we mix that with the other ingredients that goes into lye soap. And it would, most of what you would stir, or as you were looking at that, you would have a pot of ashes, and that's where that name actually comes from, potash. So the potassium in wood-burned materials, the ashes left over from wood burning, is actually very high in potassium. So is that something that you can use as a source of a potassium from an organic standpoint? Yes. The thing that I would caution you about is any of the ashes that you would have left over from charcoal that you would buy at the store. I would not suggest that you use that because it's got some other things added to it, and sometimes we've seen some issues with that particular type of ashes. But anything else that you've burned in your fireplace, yeah, even paper, because paper is made out of wood, those kind of ashes can be used as a source of potassium. Again, I would always make for sure that you do an analysis of it to see how much you're actually applying, because you don't want to over apply potassium, because again, you don't want to get the luxury consumption. So what are some sources? Like I said, the dominant one that we normally see is going to be potassium chloride, muriate of potash, KCl. It's almost always referred to as OO60. Now, how do we come up with these numbers? Well, we look at the molecular weights. And so we would take the molecular weight of potassium plus chloride, that's the total molecular weight of that compound, and we would divide it by the molecular weight, we take then the potassium molecular weight and divide it by the molecular weight of potassium chloride. Well, the molecular weight of potassium is 39, the molecular weight of chloride is 35. And we add those together and we have 74, and we take 39 divided by 74, and that comes out to be that 62. Now, why did they report 60? Well, the reason they report 60 is because there is a little bit of leeway in the fertilizer industry, and they want to make for sure that they meet that specification. They can go over it a little bit, and I think there's a little leeway to go under it, but those numbers are guaranteed analysis. If you look at a bag of organic fertilizer, it will always have a number on there as well. It's usually going to be in less than 10% though. But if it's an organic bag of fertilizer, it has to have those three numbers on it. If it is not a fertilizer, it's a soil amendment. I will visit with you a little bit about soil amendments next week as well. So its water solubility, basically 100%. So it's a very, very soluble material. Potassium magnesium sulfate, also we call it sulfomag. Let's see, how did that get there? We got some extra letters in there. I'll get that corrected for you. I'm not sure what happened there. Something didn't translate when I sent it to Joe. So it's a potassium sulfate or potassium magnesium sulfate compound. It has 22% potassium in it. It's about half soluble from a solubility standpoint. It'll be about 43% soluble. Potassium nitrate, 13044. So we've got some nitrogen in that compound and the potassium, about 74% solubility. Potassium sulfate is not quite as soluble, OO50, and you'll find these in bags of fertilizer as well. But again, when you look at the fine print, and it will always tell you what is actually in the bag, constituting the numbers that you have on the bag of fertilizer. So, forms of potassium, again, inorganic is what the plant takes up, and so this is coming from, and even in soils, even in the organic matter, the potassium that's in the organic matter is already in the inorganic form. So as soon as that plant hits the soil, as soon as that animal hits the soil, as soon as that manure hits the soil, doesn't make any difference, and we get a little bit of precipitation, it gets leached out of that, whatever that material was, it goes into the soil, it is plant available. So there is no mineralization of the potassium. Primary forms, crystalline structure of micas and feldspars makes up about somewhere between 90 and 98% of the total potassium. The fixed, somewhere between 1 and 10%, and then the readily available potassium that's going to be on the exchange sites is somewhere between 1 and 2%. And again, if you go back and look at one of those charts that I showed you, the soil in the soil solution is going to usually be 0.1 to 0.2%. Again, the ones that are what is absorbed by the plant is the potassium ion +1. It's taken up in very large concentrations, very similar to nitrogen. Nitrogen is usually our number one number one nutrient being taken up, and potassium is usually number 2. Mobility in the soil. It doesn't leach very readily, especially in medium to heavy textured soils, but again, you'll see it leach fairly readily on either low cation exchange capacity soils or coarse sandy acid soils, especially like we have in East Texas, in some areas of East Texas. Mobility in a plant. It is very mobile in the plant. It translocates readily, and so if you're going to see a deficiency symptom, it's always going to show up on the older tissue first. If it's immobile in the plant, it will show up on the younger tissue. Always remember that. Functions in the plant, it's mainly for stomatal regulation. If you look at a plant at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, most of the time it's going, at least in the summertime, most of the time it's going to be wilted, regardless of how much water the plant has available to it, just because it's usually pumping more water than it has the ability to take up through the roots. So the potassium and the chloride, for that matter, both function to regulate that stomata opening. And the stomates are the little bitty holes in the plant leaf that water and air come and go out of. And so if we've got too much water going out of the plant, the stomates will start to close, and that's regulated by potassium, and so that gives it the wilting effect, or you see the turgor pressure, the wilting of the leaf actually occurs. Carbohydrate synthesis, and this is one thing that helps us from a cold tolerance standpoint, and it gives us disease resistance. So most of the time, if we've got a deficiency with potassium, we are going to see some winter kill if we have a hard winter. And depending on where you are in the state of Texas, that varies. If we get 2 or 3 days of freezing temperature here, that's a hard winter. You get a month of freezing temperatures up on the high plains, that would be a hard winter. Down here, that would really be a hard winter. The deficiency symptoms, we get lodging. Now, lodging in grain crops means that it basically falls over. Marginal leaf scorch, and I'll show you a picture of this in just a little bit. And again, we get the winter kill on perennial grasses. Now, we also see this happening with phosphorus, and so really, if you're working with the forage crops, make for sure that they've got good phosphorus and potassium amounts late in the fall, so that the starches, the carbohydrates, can be stored in the grass roots, so that next spring, whenever time for the soil warms up enough that the grasses start coming out, that there's sufficient quantity of energy there so that they can go ahead and come back out. If you have marginal amounts of phosphorus or potassium, you may end up with some winter kill. So, some deficiency symptoms. That leaf spotting, or that leaf marginal dieback on the leaf, this is tea. This is clover. You can see on the tip ends of the clover that it's starting to die back. And this is basically what happens on, dicots. Corn, monocot, so we see the edges of the leaf being fired, but yet we have a very green midrib. Soybean, another dicot, firing on the edges. Grapes, firing on the edges, and apple, again, firing on the edges. So the dicots, we get the firing on the edges or at the leaf tip. With the monocots, we get it on both sides of the leaf as well, with a very green midrib. This is a good example of winter dieback based on potassium in this particular case. And so this is early. This is about a month into the growing season, and we're getting very little grass coming back in that particular area where we've got a potassium deficiency. This is potassium deficiency on cotton. Again, along the leaf edges, and we've got basically a very green midrib. Notice on it's on the older leaves and not on the younger leaves. So, how is potassium taken up by the plant? Very similar in what we saw with nitrogen and phosphorus. We've got pounds per acre on the y-axis, and days after planting on the x-axis. Again, somewhere between that 15 to 20 days, we really start to use the potassium, whether it be a corn or grain sorghum. And so if you're planting something that's coming up from a seed, you're looking at about 15 to 25 days that you really need to make for sure that you've got sufficient potassium to be available to the plant. If you're using an organic source of potassium, again, this one's not like the others. Okay, not like the other nutrients. You don't necessarily have to get the organic source out 2 to 4 weeks prior to when the nutrients are needed, because you don't go through mineralization. But you do need moisture. We've got to have moisture to actually leach that nutrient out of the organic material and into the soil. So it would still behoove you to go ahead and add the organic source a couple of weeks early, so that you've got hopefully got plenty of opportunity to have some rain to soak the soil, the material, and get the potassium to actually leach out of that and into the soil. So how do we manage for potassium? If needed, we apply the potassium based on soil test recommendations. Best to apply in small quantities, 1 to 3 times per year. If we're looking at more than 150 pounds per acre, and most of the time we'll actually say even 75 pounds per acre, we want to split these applications. So if you're putting out, you're going to spoon feed your nitrogen. If you've got these 150 pounds per acre application rates recommended for potassium, we suggest that you split that application as well as for the potassium, and for 2 reasons again. 1, for the luxury consumption, and 2nd, for the high salt index that you have for potassium. And again, remember, if you're putting out a pop-up fertilizer, you always want that actually goes in with the seed. You always want to make for sure that you have 10 pounds or less of nitrogen plus potassium in that fertilizer that you're putting down with the seed. Otherwise, you have the potential to salt the seed out. So again, if you're putting out if you've got a recommendation of 150 pounds or more, you want to split that application. We would usually recommend that you put out about half to 2/3 at green up, and then you would come back with the other half to 1/3 at the second application of your nitrogen. So you get it split about roughly 2 ways there. Multiple applications help also reduce that leaching potential, especially if you have the very sandy soils. If you've got the medium textured to very fine textured soils, you're not going to lose the potassium. This luxury consumption is the uptake of the nutrient in amounts greater than what's required for optimum growth, and again, potassium is one of those that's really guilty of that. So again, the split applications really makes a big difference and reduces that potential to run out of potassium at the end of the growing season, which is when you usually are getting your seed fill of whatever maximum production at that time. So you want to make for sure that you don't run out of that particular nutrient. Antagonism. This is one of those where potassium can cause you some issues. It's a nutrient interaction with other elements, in this particular case with magnesium and calcium. So if we are getting out too much potassium, we can actually get an antagonistic effect with magnesium or calcium. So you really want to watch how much you're actually applying at any given time. So now not only can you get luxury consumption, you can get the and potential for leaching in the sandy soils, the potential for salting out your seeds. You can also get this antagonism with magnesium or calcium. So potassium is one of those that you really need to watch and apply it at the proper rates so that you don't have some of these issues that can sneak up on you. The fixation, we can lose some potassium again with the 2-to-1 layer clays. This reduces the availability of the potassium, and it actually fixes it to the point where it's not going to be available to the plant until that particular 2-to-1 layer clay actually goes ahead and weathers. So it can be an irreversible fixation until that particular clay weathers to release that potassium. So how do we manage this from the standpoint of application? Well, pre-plant applications near seeding or at green up is the best. This improves its efficiency, reduces the potential for runoff and leaching. Potassium is one of those that we have not seen any detrimental effects from an environment standpoint, but that doesn't mean that we want to over apply it. But it just means that, thank goodness, we're not seeing any detrimental issues. Now, there are some potential issues with lactating cows that you can induce milk fever with high concentrations of potassium. That's what the dairy nutritionists have told me. I have not seen that occur, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't occur. So if you're working with dairy cows, make for sure that you watch that potassium, and especially the potassium to magnesium and calcium ratio, so that you don't get that milk fever being caused. Pop-up fertilizer, again, just make for sure that you're not getting that salt impact, and you watch the nitrogen plus potassium ratio amount to be 10 pounds or less, so that you don't get this salt impact on your seeds that are trying to germinate. Side dress limits the positional availability. It's better if it's down below the seed, but this also works as well. And again, you can put out all of the fertilizer you need if you're below the seed a couple of inches, or to the side of the seed a couple of inches and below. You always want to be below the seed, because most of your roots are going to go down rather than coming up. Foliar application, we don't recommend it. It really there's been very mixed results with foliar feeding of potassium, and so we really don't recommend it for a couple reasons. Number one, you get too much, you burn the plant. Number two, we just don't see the results that you need to, and it's costly. So much better to put it into the soil and let the roots do their job the way they're supposed to. Split the applications are recommended on the perennial forage crops, especially if we've got a lot of potassium recommended. And we would probably recommend it again at 75 pounds per acre, that you do. Anything over that you get a split application, and definitely at 150 pounds per acre. How do we put it out? Well, broadcast. We suggest that it be incorporated to reduce the potential for runoff and erosion, but usually if we can get just a little bit of precipitation, because most of our potassium fertilizers are fairly soluble, if we can get a little bit of precipitation, or we can use irrigation, even 1/4 of an inch is enough to get it incorporated. So that mechanism incorporates it, but mechanically incorporating it makes for sure that we get the reduction of runoff and erosion losses. Again, we can band it or inject it. This is very effective to improve the positional availability in the low potassium soils that we may have. And again, we see this all over Texas, but for the most part, where we see low potassium supplying soils is usually going to be more in the East Texas acid soils that we have. Infer with the seed, again, go back to that nitrogen plus potassium, less than 10 pounds per acre. And again, foliar, we just don't recommend it. Doesn't seem to be effective at all. So to give you some examples of, from a cotton standpoint, where we had 2 years of applications, control, no application, where we side dressed, foliar nitrogen, foliar NP and K, and then foliar NP and K plus micros. So where we put the side dress on, we got very good results the first year and the second year. Where we put foliar nitrogen on, the second year we actually got a boost in the amount of yield as compared to anything else. But you notice that foliar application of NP and K actually gives us a reduction in our yield for the most part, especially in year 2. And when you put micros on, doesn't do any good. So again, in this particular case, it didn't do any good. So we typically recommend you're going to do the side dress or application prior to planting or at planting if you can. The foliar applications, again, really and truly do not do much good for the most. Base your rates on a realistic yield goal. This is critical. It is amazing the number of people will send in a soil sample and their yield goal is maximum. That doesn't help us a whole lot from a standpoint of what you have the ability to do. So if say for instance in hybrid Bermuda grasses, if you've been producing 4 tons per acre, don't kick it up to 6 because you probably can't do that. If you've been from a lawn and garden standpoint, we really don't have realistic yield goals, but we have more of a homeowner recommendations for those. So it's still a realistic yield goal from a standpoint that how do you want your grass to look? Do you want it to be deep dark green, or do you want it to be nice and you have to cut it once a week? If it's deep dark green, you probably need to be cutting that grass about 2 or 3 times a week, about every 2 to 3 days. Now, most of us are not going to do that. So we can have a nice lawn, cut it once a week, and it look nice, and we put out roughly 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet of nitrogen, and if we need the potassium, put that all out at the early part of the growing season, or you can put out a whole bunch of nitrogen and really need to be out there mowing several times a week. High levels reported by soil test for clay soils accurately indicate sufficiency. There's not a time that you need to make that soluble or make it available to the plant. It's available to the plant. So if you get a soil test back from our laboratory that says that you've got sufficient quantities of potassium, you've got sufficient quantities of potassium. You don't need to be applying any additional amount. Again, the split applications on sandy textured soils, this works very well, and it improves the growth. It decreases the amount of luxury consumption that we have. It improves the winter hardiness, and we get a really good early spring response when we have good carbohydrates stored in our roots for the plants. So if you take a look at this map, an antique but still pretty reflective of the potassium levels that we have across the state of Texas. The kind of orangey color and much darker red colors that we have over here in East Texas, those are where we have most of our deficiencies from potassium. The brown colors are fairly medium, the dark blue colors are high, and the brown colors the tan colors are very high. So about 3/4 of the state of Texas, we probably do not need to be applying potassium. So be very careful. Again, the soil test is the best thing to rely upon as far as making decisions as to how much nutrient needs to be applied. So Routine analysis from our soil testing laboratory is very similar to what you will see from most other laboratories that will give you pH, conductivity, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sodium, and sulfur. Some laboratories will not report sodium, some laboratories will not report nitrate, but most of them, at least in the state of Texas, typically do, because we do. So take a look at those. Our test is $10. Most of the time you'll see that being pretty representative across most of the other commercial laboratories that people use within the state of Texas. Our recommendations, again, are going to be based on that sufficiency that I talked about when we talked about nitrogen. And so the potassium recommendations that you will get from commercial laboratories in comparison to A&M will actually be very similar. They may be just a little bit above A&M's recommendation, but typically they're very close. Nitrogen is typically very close regardless of what laboratory you're getting your analysis or your recommendations from. And then the phosphorus is usually where we have our dominant differences in the amount that's being recommended. Usually A&M is a little bit lower than most of the commercial laboratories. And we'll talk about the other nutrients here in just a little bit from a commercial laboratory standpoint. So that takes care of potassium. Now we'll move to the other macronutrients that we consider to be secondary macronutrients. This would be calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Forms in the soil. When we're looking at calcium, calcium is usually the dominant cation that we have in most of our soils. About the only soils that this is not the dominant cation in, or at least in the state of Texas, are going to be our soils that are, again, in these acid sandy situations, or the acid soils that you saw from the map that I just showed you, where we have deficiency potentials for potassium. It's also where we're going to usually not have calcium being the dominant cation that we have in soils. Usually it will originate from calcium-bearing minerals, and the typical ones are going to be calcite and dolomite. Now, calcite is calcium carbonate. Dolomite is a magnesium calcium carbonate. It's present in soils primarily in inorganic forms, but we also have it from an organic standpoint, and it can be adhere to the organic molecule, and it would have to go through mineralization coming from an organic standpoint. Magnesium originates again from magnesium-bearing minerals. This would be biotite. This is a mica. This is the light-colored mica. Dolomite, which I just talked about, and then chlorite, which is a 2 to 1 layer clay. All of these are fairly easily weathered, and so very easy to produce to get magnesium from these particular minerals. Exists primarily as an exchangeable form, just like calcium, and so most of the calcium and magnesium will be taken up from the soil solution. There's an equilibrium set up between the exchange sites, and so most of the plant available forms are going to be coming from the exchange sites, very similar to potassium. Sulfur. Now, sulfur is the one that's a little different. It's similar to nitrogen in that it is an anion, and phosphorus. It is an anion. So it is actually repelled by the cation exchange capacity, or the cation exchange sites, because the cation exchange sites also have a net negative charge. So like charges get repelled. So the sulfate has the ability to actually be leached. Large portion of it is associated with the humic fraction of the soil organic matter, so it's associated with the organic molecule. If we've got so we have an organic source of sulfur, and we have the inorganic sources of sulfur. The organic sulfurs associated with the organic matter have to go through the mineralization process to be available to the plant, because it converts it from the organic source of sulfur to the inorganic sulfate, which is plant available. So sulfate is the dominant form of sulfur that is taken up by plants, and it's the dominant form of sulfur that we have in most soils. It can also be found in soils as elemental sulfur and sulfides, especially under anaerobic conditions or waterlogged conditions or saturated conditions. So where we have situations like, well, growing rice, for instance, or if you've got a water feature in your yard where you actually are growing different types of aquatic plants, right below the surface of the sediment, then you actually get reducing conditions because you've got a waterlogged situation, no oxygen there, and so you have the potential to have the presence of sulfides. Now, if we ever get if that material ever becomes oxidized, then this will actually generate some acids, and you got to be careful about how you handle those. Again, the plant available forms for calcium are calcium +2, so it will adhere to the exchange sites. Magnesium is also +2. Again, the bases are calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, and they are also very abundant as far as the Earth's crust is concerned. Sulfur is an anion, and so it has a net -2 charge, and so we're looking at something that can be repelled by the cation exchange sites. It also reacts very well with calcium, magnesium, most of the other metals or cations that we have in soils. Calcium sulfate is gypsum, magnesium sulfate is Epsom salt, and so we have both of those in the soil. Mobility in the soil, calcium is adsorbed to the soil surface on the exchange sites, so we don't get very much leaching with it. And again, because it is a +2 cation as compared to a +1 cation that we have for potassium, the potassium is more susceptible to leaching than calcium or magnesium because of the charge. So calcium and magnesium we really don't see from a leaching standpoint, with the exception of as far as weathering of soils over a long period of time. So calcium and magnesium are not subject to leaching, but they are very much subject to erosion because they adhere to the exchange sites. Sulfur as an anion is much more subject to leaching, and again particularly in our acid sandy soil. Mobility in a plant. Calcium is not translocated in plants. And so it will be, you will see this first of all in the new growth. So this is the first one that we've had that is not mobile in the plant. All the other macronutrients have been very mobile in the plant, but calcium is not. Magnesium, on the other hand, is readily translocated within the plant. And so we see the deficiency symptoms first on the older growth. Now magnesium is also associated with the chlorophyll molecule. And so it relates to the greenness of our plants, very similar to nitrogen, but the deficiency symptoms are very different. And I'll show you a picture on a corn leaf here in just a little bit. Sulfur, not translocated in plants. So again, the deficiency symptoms are going to be observed first on the new growth. So calcium and sulfur are not translocated in the plant. Calcium, magnesium are not very mobile in the soil. Sulfur is actually fairly mobile in the soil. So a little bit different as far as how these particular cations actually react. Now, from the standpoint of how much is in the plant, even though we call these secondary macronutrients, they're actually usually fairly concentrated in the plant. The calcium is usually going to be somewhere between 1 to probably 4%, especially the plants that are alkaline loving plants like most of our legumes do much better in alkaline soils as compared to acid soils. And so you may have 2, 3, or 4% calcium in those kinds of plants, like beans, peas, alfalfa. Magnesium is typically going to be in the 0.1 to 0.5%. Sulfur is going to be similar to that, 0.1 to 0.5%. I've seen the sulfur as high as in the 1%. So a little bit lower magnesium and sulfur, actually very similar to phosphorus, whereas calcium is more similar to the nitrogen and potassium in most plants. So why do we call them secondary if they're similar to what we call the primary macronutrients? Well, we usually don't have to put them back into the soil. Most of the time they're sufficient in the soil. And so that's one of the reasons why we call them secondary. But the other thing is usually they're a little bit lower in concentration, especially compared to nitrogen and potassium. Functions in the plant. Calcium, cell wall structure, cell wall division, and a lot from an enzyme activity standpoint. Well, what happens from a deficiency standpoint? Well, we get failure of the terminal buds. So we don't get very good setting of whatever our harvestable crop happens to be. We get poor root formation and growth, and so you usually have stunted roots. So very different compared to the other nutrients that we talked about. Again, magnesium, chlorophyll formation, and enzyme activity. We get interveinal chlorosis on this and leaf bronzing. So the leaf kind of turn, especially on dicots, we get more of a leaf bronzing, whereas on the monocots we get this interveinal chlorosis more or less. Sulfur is a part of the amino acids. And then because of it's part of the amino acids, it's part of the protein formation. So very much intertwined with the organic molecule. Very good, very functional component in the nitrogenase enzyme, which is required for nitrogen fixation of plants. So it plays a very major role as far as the nitrogen fixers are concerned. Symptoms are general leaf chlorosis, very similar to nitrogen, and it gets kind of a whitish color, whereas nitrogen deficiency usually gives you more of a yellowing. The sulfur deficiency gives you more of a white color. Now, because of telling you what these deficiency symptoms look like, is this going to make you be able to walk out, look at a plant and be able to tell what nutrient is deficient in that particular plant? Probably not. Maybe for the N, P, and K. But for the rest of them, maybe magnesium. For the rest of them, it usually gets a little confusing. And most of the time, if we have a deficiency of one nutrient, 9 times out of 10 we got a deficiency on some other nutrient. So when you start seeing deficiency symptoms, sometimes it's a combination of several different elements. So it gets very difficult in trying to figure out what's really going on. So how do we take care of this? Well, the best thing to do is to take leaves that look good and leaves that don't look good, and send both of those into a lab, and also do a soil test at the same time. Tissue analysis without a soil test doesn't help you very much. So you always want to do a soil test at the same time that you're doing the tissue analysis. And then the comparison between the two leaf tissues should help you make the determination as to what is actually deficient. Now, the kicker sometimes that happens is because we've got stunted growth on most of our deficient plants, many times what will happen is you will see a much higher concentration of many of the elements as compared to what you would if the plant was growing normally. So it seems to be because the plant is still taking that nutrient up, but it's not being distributed over as much plant as it normally would be. So it appears that we're actually getting luxury consumption of some of these elements where we're actually becoming very deficient in some of those elements. So that's one of the primary reasons why the tissue analysis can sometimes be a little tricky. So deficiency symptoms, and looking at calcium. In peanuts, we get a deficiency called POPs. The peanut itself does not form very well, and the hull will actually pop open. So got big problems from a peanut standpoint. And in leaf spotting, this is on a peanuts as well, from a bronzing standpoint. Now, we've actually seen when you grow peanuts in a sandy soil to start with, because they won't grow well, you could grow them in clayey soils, but they look kind of funny when they actually produce a peanut. But in sandy soils, because it's easy to dig them in sandy soils, it's easy to get the sand off of the peanut so that you can process it very easily. We have seen, you remember I was telling you about the antagonism that potassium can cause on calcium and or magnesium. Several years ago, a particular commercial soil testing laboratory was recommending a little too much potassium, and they were actually, those recommendations were inducing a calcium deficiency antagonism on peanuts. And so we had a whole bunch of acres up on the central part of the state of Texas where they're growing peanuts now, have this particular issue. So be very careful when you're managing your nutrients, especially in sandy soils, that you don't get too much of one, especially potassium, over calcium and magnesium, because you can actually induce some deficiency symptoms there. So be very careful with that. I think we've got that taken care of, and I don't think that laboratory is recommending as much potassium as they were before. This is sulfur deficiency. Okay, we get some, you remember in nitrogen, it's a V-shaped firing of the plant. And in this particular case, this whole plant is just a light color, whereas this is a plant that should be okay. So just a kind of a whitish, tip on the tip end of that particular leaf. So the sulfur gives you much lighter color of the plant as compared to a plant that is sufficient with sulfur. So my little thing that I've used before. This is a corn leaf that is sufficient in all nutrients. This is phosphorus deficiency, purpling of the edges, and a very green midrib. Potassium is a firing of the edges and a green midrib. The nitrogen is a V-shaped firing of the midrib and green on the outside. Now again, magnesium is associated with the chlorophyll molecule, but we get a striping effect of the ribs are green, but the intervenal areas are chlorotic. So don't have all the different nutrients, but those are we talked about each one of those, so I thought I'd show this again. Some different sources of calcium. Again, the dominant one that you're going to see for calcium, there's two. One is going to be calcitic limestone, and we usually use that to raise the pH. The other one, another one that is dolomitic limestone. The dolomitic limestone is much less soluble than the calcitic limestone. So if you need the magnesium, we will recommend the dolomitic limestone. If you don't need the magnesium, we'll usually recommend calcitic limestone because it is much more soluble. Gypsum, calcium sulfate. That C that's in the middle there, that should be a dot. I apologize again, translating from my PowerPoint to Joe's, we went to a C. So that should be a dot. So there's calcium sulfate with 2 waters associated with it. So that C there should be an actual dot. Amount of calcium in the dolomitic limestone and gypsum is 22%, 40% in the calcite. Ordinary superphosphate is a calcium phosphate plus gypsum. We very seldom see the ordinary superphosphate and the triple superphosphate being used as a source of fertilizer now. I'm not sure why. We see a lot more of it being used in animal feed, and so not near as much of it's being used in commercial fertilizers today. The monoammonium phosphate and diammonium phosphate is used much more than the calcium phosphates are. Magnesium, again, dolomitic limestone. This a combination of calcium plus magnesium carbonate. Depending on what how much magnesium is actually there, you're going to end up with somewhere between 8 and 20% magnesium in that compound. Magnesium sulfate, which is Epsom salt, and again, this C that's there should be a dot. So it's magnesium sulfate with 7 waters attached to it. And then potassium magnesium sulfate, which is Kmag or sulfomag, and again, that C should be a dot. Potassium sulfate with 2 magnesium sulfates. I'll have to check that a lot closer next time, so I apologize for that. Percent of magnesium in each of those, somewhere between 8 and 20% on the dolomite, and about 10 or 11% on the Epsom salts and the sulfomag. Good sources, especially the sulfomag, because you get the potassium, magnesium, and the sulfur there. And again, we use the dolomitic limestone to raise the pH. So if you're low in calcium and or magnesium, by adding agricultural limestone either as calcite or dolomite, you also add calcium and magnesium to the system. So it's a secondary effect of the lime. Sources of sulfur, lots of different sources of sulfur, and I've already used several of these. Ammonium sulfate, for every pound of nitrogen you have on ammonium sulfate, you end up with a little bit more, a little over a pound of sulfur. So very good sources of sulfur is ammonium sulfate. Ammonium thiosulfate, about the same amount of sulfur as you have in ammonium sulfate, but about twice as much as what you have nitrogen in that particular case. So for every pound of nitrogen, you put out about 2 pounds of sulfur in that case. The Epsom salt, and again, here's my C, so knock that out and put a dot there. About 14% sulfur. Ordinary superphosphate, also about 14% sulfur. Sulfomag, again, the C should be a dot, about 23% sulfur, which is about the same amount of potassium. Potassium sulfate, very good source of potassium, also a good source of sulfur. Gypsum, again, good source of calcium, also a good source of sulfur, and again, that C should be a dot. Elemental sulfur, very high in sulfur, about 88 to 98%. Do not recommend that you use this as a source of sulfur for most of your homeowner needs. This is a good source if you want to try to acidify the soil, but you really got to be careful with this one, because you put this into the soil very rapidly. The microorganisms use it, produce sulfuric acid, and if you don't have very much buffer capacity there, or the ability for that sulfuric acid to react with bases, you could go from whatever your soil pH was to about 2 or 3, and all of your plants are dead. So if you're going to use elemental sulfur, be very, very careful, and we'll talk about that next week when we're talking about acidifying the soil. So what are some management considerations? Well, again, go back to the soil test to make for sure you identify if you've got any potential deficiencies. If you don't, you don't need to be applying them. Every time you apply a nutrient, a source of fertilizer or source of nutrients, make for sure you need that nutrient. If you don't need the nutrient, why pay for those things? Now, when we're using organic sources of nutrients, there's a tremendous amount. I mean, almost all organics are going to have all different nutrients in it. Sometimes we will have some that will be dominant, but other times we won't. Next week I'll give you a list of organic materials that we normally recommend, that we have in the Master Gardener Handbook, and so I'll put that up as one of the slides that we'll use next week to look at all the, especially the N, P, and K, but I'll go over some of the other ones from the manure standpoint as well, or some of the other nutrients from the manure standpoint. So calcium deficiency symptoms are uncommon, with the exception of our very sandy soils, low cation exchange capacity soils, and where we have low pHs. We can correct it with adding agricultural limestone, or we can use gypsum if we have alkaline soils. So usually, but usually in alkaline soils, we usually have a sufficient quantity of calcium because calcium carbonate is usually present in our alkaline soils. Magnesium, again, it's basically the same place, same thing from the standpoint of calcium. We very seldom have deficiency symptoms except where we have the potential, or where we have the acid sandy soils. We correct it with, we've got acid sandy soils, we're going to add limestone anyway, and so in that particular case we would choose the dolomitic limestone. We can also use potassium K-mag, or the sulfo mag, which is the same thing, or we can use Epsom salt, magnesium sulfate. Sulfur, again, very similar to calcium and magnesium. We're usually going to see our deficiency symptoms are likely in sandy soils, but not very much in anything else. A lot of times in our when we do soil tests, every once in a while we will come up with sulfur being indicating that there's a deficiency. What we have found is because sulfur, the sulfate will leach, what we're finding is that we usually don't have if we apply sulfur as a sulfate, we usually don't see a response. And the reason for that is because we've had sulfur leach below concentrations in the 6 to 12, 6 to 24 inch range that are sufficient for plant to grow. And so once the plants get into that 6 to 24 inch layer, as far as the roots are concerned, then there's plenty of sulfur there. So many times we don't see, we may not see a response to sulfur. But now, if you've got a recommendation for sulfur, especially in your sandy textured soils, you're probably going to see a response. My suggestion is that you get a recommendation, you add the sulfur, and see if you get a response. So add some sulfur in one area, don't add it in another area, and just kind of do a little experiment in your own yard or garden or field for that matter. And if you see a response, then you need to make for sure that you put it out, especially the next year. If you don't see a response, then you've got plenty of sulfur down below that 6 inches. Very easily corrected with gypsum, K-mag, sulfomag, Epsom salt. Any of those will have sulfur in them. Organics, almost all of our organic sources are going to have sufficient sulfur to correct any kind of deficiencies, especially if you're applying at the nitrogen crop requirement, or even the phosphorus crop requirement for that organic source. Deep-rooted crops, again, often don't respond to the sulfur applications because there's plenty of sulfur with depth in a lot of our soils. I'll use this one next week as well, but because I talked about the sulfur acidifying the soil, I wanted to go ahead and put this one in there, but I'll also use this slide next week. So if you're trying to acidify the soil, this is in soils that have no carbonates in them. Now, when you get to pHs above 7.5, more than likely you have carbonates in your soils. But anyway, this is just to give you an example of how much it would take to lower the pH from one point to another point if you did not have carbonates in the soil. So if you have any carbonates in the soil, for every 1% carbonate that you have in the soil, you have to add at least 1 ton of elemental sulfur to take care of that 1% carbonate. So if we are trying to change the pH from 6.5 to 7, in a sandy soil it would take about 100 pounds of sulfur per acre, 150 pounds in a loam, 300 pounds in a clay. We're going from 6.5 to 7.5, 7.5 to 6.5, going backwards here. If you want to go from 7.5 pH to 6.5, it takes about 100 pounds of sulfur in a sand, 800 for a loam, 1,000 in a clay. And all the way up to the top, if you're going to try to go from 8.5 to 6.5, ton in a sandy soil, 2,500 pounds in a loam, 1.5 tons on a clay. And that's without carbonate. So if we add a % carbonate to that, all of a sudden for the sand we would be at 2 tons, we'd be at 4,500 pounds on the loam, we'd be at 5,000 pounds on the clay. So again, I'll talk about acidifying the soil next week and some of the issues that we have in trying to make those decisions on exactly how much elemental sulfur to apply, especially if we have carbonates there. So with that, I think that's my last slide.